All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learns to Hunt presents Habitat Management Techniques for Illinois Hunters. Before we get started tonight, I just want to go over a few housekeeping things. If this is your first webinar with us, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Same rules follows as always. So your microphones and webcams will be disabled. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation as we work through it. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A window at any time. You can put your question in there, and either the presenter will answer that live or it will be answered in the chat by one of the other presenters. We will also have time at the end for a Q&A session. So any questions you may think of while we're moving through the PowerPoint here, feel free to ask us at the end. We'll stick around for a little bit and answer any questions you may have. And we also have a chat window, so that's different than the Q&A window. You can use that to communicate amongst each other or with us. So feel free to use that as well. You will also be receiving an email after this presentation with a copy of this PowerPoint, as well as some informative handouts and a link to a recording of this webinar for your reference, and a survey that we appreciate if you take a couple minutes to fill that out. That helps our program out, get some data there on the people we're reaching out to and how to improve our program. So it only takes a few minutes, and we'd really appreciate if you could fill that out and send it back to us. It's all electronic. No stamps or anything needed for that one. So we have a couple presenters tonight. With us, we have Dan Stevens. Dan, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight.
We also have Adam with us. Adam, would you like to say hello?
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us tonight.
I'm Jason Buckley. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we also have with us Curtis. Curtis, would you like to say hello?
Good evening, everybody.
And also joining us tonight, we have a special guest. We have Preston Chapman. Preston, would you like to say hello and tell everybody kind of what your position is and kind of what you do here in Illinois?
How's it going, everyone? Yeah, I'm Preston Chapman. I'm a biologist with Pheasants Forever. I'm based out of Southern Illinois, more forever. It's more of a biologist pheasant. We're working with benefit a pheasant, the benefits of pheasant, a benefit of turkey. Just a little bit.
That's great. Hey, Preston. Yeah, your microphone there is not working the best, but just to let everybody know that he is a farm bill biologist. He works with Pheasants Forever and Quails Forever, and he's part of their team there who oversees their habitat management program there through the Pheasants and Quail Forever. And hopefully, as we move through our presentation, he's able to talk a little bit better than that. I do know he's in a rural location tonight and was nice enough to call in to the webinar. So hopefully we can hear a little bit better from him moving forward here. But so he works with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. Dan, if you want to give a little bit of a pitch for that, since Preston might be a little glitchy.
Yeah, sure. So Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever is a great nonprofit, non-governmental organization here that really prides themselves. You can see their slogan right there, the Habitat Organization. And that's what they really pride themselves on, is rebuilding some of this really critical habitat that we've lost, over the past few decades, particularly in Illinois. And you'll see that as we kind of progress through this conversation tonight. You'll see how important habitat is to wildlife management, to conservation, to our lives as humans, but also to us as hunters. So yeah, you can see their information here. If you want to learn more about Pheasants or Quail Forever, you can visit their website at ihuntillinois.com or visit them on Facebook. And the cool thing about an organization like Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever is if you're brand new to hunting, it is a great way to basically meet like-minded individuals kind of in your area, because they're a very chapter-based organization. So they have chapters pretty much scattered all across the state. And so if you're a brand new hunter, or maybe you're looking to do some habitat management on your work, reach out to the Pheasants Forever staff or Quail Forever staff, and they'll be able to put you in the right direction.
Awesome. So a quick overview. This is a very broad overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight, but we're going to be talking about habitat management and why it's important to hunters especially. And we're going to go over the types of habitat and strategies that you may use to manage these different types of habitat, because there's, of course, different strategies for different types of habitat. So we'll go over those. And then we'll talk about species preferred habitat and then how you can manage that habitat to make that species a little bit more stronger on your landscape there. And this is going to be good for anyone who has private land, but also for public land users, because you might see some of these projects going on your public land that you may be using, and you'll be able to understand a little bit more in detail about the goals of that. And so a more educated hunter is what we're going for here. And it's going to be good for anyone to really learn more about these different projects and different strategies that you may see be used on public land and private land around you. And then again, at the end, we'll have time for that Q&A session at the end if you have any questions about habitat management. And to get us started, we're going to be starting off here with Dan. So Dan, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And we first wanted to start off with a brief conversation about why we kind of planned and scheduled this webinar. And again, we're really trying to highlight some of the important wildlife habitat techniques that are used on both public and private land to manage habitat for wildlife. And as a hunter, we're kind of taking it from a different lens, as opposed to, a private landowner who's trying to kind of restore their area. We're focusing on the biology and on the hunting side of things, and how you can strategically use some of these management techniques on your own private land. Or what we're really focusing on is what to expect when you visit some of these public land Illinois DNR sites. A lot of these sites are managed fairly extensively, and as a hunter, it's important to understand their mindset of why they're making these management decisions, but also how it impacts how the wildlife use a certain area and how that can kind of aid in your hunt planning process. So as we go through these distinct management techniques, that's kind of the lens we're going to work through. Now, one thing I do want to highlight is we're going to cover a variety of different management techniques tonight. And so this isn't necessarily a how-to guide. It's not going to talk step-by-step about every single practice that we're discussing. We're going to kind of give a brief overview of what the practice looks like, how that practice impacts the habitat, how it impacts wildlife, and then some basic steps about how you could do that on personal property if that's your goal. So what is habitat management? Habitat management is essentially you're doing kind of aggressive management, not necessarily passive, but aggressive management to benefit wildlife and wildlife habitats. Management can not only increase the amount of wildlife in an area, it can increase their habitat use, it can improve the overall health and quality of that individual animal or of that individual species. But it also promotes biodiversity. And as we'll kind of progress through this conversation tonight, you'll notice that a lot of Illinois is kind of a biological desert, right? We've seen this kind of mass shift from, small family acre, 40 acre size farms to these large mega farms that are sometimes full sections, so 640 acres. And so these management techniques just allow us as conservationists to rebuild some of that biodiversity that's missing on the landscape. Now, I will caveat that management does have limitations. Obviously, there's an economic side of things. How cost effective is this management strategy? And go over some kind of return on investment. So we'll highlight some of those as we go through this webinar tonight. And why should hunters care about habitat management? We hear this a lot, that hunters are kind of the stewards of the landscape in a lot of cases. If you've viewed some of our other webinars, you've seen how concrete we highlight the importance of hunting as a wildlife management tool. But habitat management is just as important as hunting in terms of conservation management, if not more so. And so again, we can increase habitat use, increase food and cover availability, but it can really influence your hunting efforts and your hunt planning on both public and private land. Now, a couple things that we want to highlight. There is a few programs, and Preston will kind of jump in on this too. But the big program in Illinois is the Illinois Acres for Wildlife. And this is a voluntary program in which landowners they always retain complete control of their property. So if you enroll property into this Illinois Acres for Wildlife program, you are not losing ownership of that property. You are always going to retain that. So I wanted to make that clear first. But in return for IDNR assistance, the landowner is essentially going to pledge their willingness to protect and improve habitat on their land. And now you may ask, well, okay, so what does the landowner get? Well, the landowner gets a lot out of this program. So IDNR will provide a resource assessment. So they'll look over your individual property, do a site assessment, and develop a full-fledged management plan on how they would go about managing that property for a specific species. And this is where Preston's going to come in and kind of highlight some of these different Farm Bill programs that are available. So the Federal Farm Bill program is federal legislation that's passed roughly every 4 years. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Preston. Okay, perfect. And every farm bill has these programs that are built in, and these programs are really unique in that it's basically the federal government providing you funds and paying you to do a management practice. And so let's say you're a farmer and you have 640 acres of corn, and maybe some of it's not very productive, maybe around the fringes or in some wet areas. You're not just getting a high corn yield. Well, instead of continually farming that unproductive ground, you can enroll it in some of these conservation programs and basically receive a payment from the federal government per year for the length of that contract.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, CRP and EQIP are, generally your smaller type programs, where CREP and WRE are your large landscape style, 200-300 acre farms that it may have once been a wetland type habitat, and you want to reconvert everything into habitat. They'll actually pay you essentially back. I think it's about $4,000 to $5,000 an acre, depending on where you're at, to put that land into that program. So,
perfect.
Lots of money out there.
Perfect. And if you have any questions about these Farm Bill programs, reach out to Preston, or reach out to the NRCS, which is your Natural Resource Conservation Service, or the Soil and Water Conservation District for your individual county. And they can provide you a lot more information about these programs, because there are strict criteria to be able to enroll acreage into these programs. And so it's important to have those conversations up front before you kind of make any decisions or try to start planning in your head. You want to make sure you meet that criteria first. And now I'm going to turn it over to Curtis, and he's going to talk a little bit about some habitat types in Illinois.
All right, thanks, Dan. So yeah, Illinois, right? We are a state that does not touch an ocean. We do not touch any mountains, but for not having those two things, we're really a pretty diverse state. And this map over here on the right kind of shows that. You go way up in the northwestern region and you get a little bit of that Wisconsin driftless area, a lot of topography and woods, and a real beautiful area. Of course, we're in the Central Plains, dominated by agriculture, but we've got, of course, we touch the Great Lakes, which is its own unique habitat type. Got the Mississippi River on the western edge, which is a unique habitat type in of itself. And we've got the nice mixed hardwood bottomland forest around there, and all the way down to the southern tip where we get into even some coastal plain type habitat type. So really pretty diverse state for being landlocked and being relatively flat, but a lot has changed. And if we look at this map over here on the left, we can see sort of what Illinois looked like pre-settlement. And it's a lot of white in there, which if you look at the little key, that means grassland. So the majority of Illinois was grassland, a lot of big timber, and some other habitat types in there as well. But fast forward today, and we're pretty yellow. I think if we were any more yellow, we'd be a banana. So we're definitely dominated by agriculture now. Everything that almost everything that used to be grasslands is now agriculture. And then of course the forest land has subsided quite a bit to make room. And that of course has to do with Illinois being a very fertile state, and agriculture feeds the world. So as ag has gotten bigger, need to be more efficient, we have sort of sacrifice some of this habitat for agricultural land. So we're definitely dealing with an altered landscape today, but that doesn't mean it's not useful to wildlife, or it can't be made better for wildlife. And we're going to really get into that in some of these slides coming up here. All right, agricultural habitat. So we've seen this is the dominant land feature across Illinois. And in some areas of Illinois, it certainly doesn't look like this, but where we are in the Champaign area, we do see a lot of landscape that's reminiscent to these two pictures down here. So a lot of big, wide open farmland. And, this is really a seasonal resource that has very limited use to wildlife. Now, a little bit of agriculture, especially when it's mixed with other habitat types like woody cover, that can be a great thing because that is a seasonally abundant food source for them that just so happens to become ready right about hunting season, which can be great. But when you look at those two pictures down there, and you see for a good portion of the year, there's going to be no cover at all. And it's only going to be useful to a handful of species of birds. And when the corn is growing, it might be useful to deer and a handful of critters like that, but certainly not the diversity that a nice mixed habitat stand would have. But there are some things that we can do to make this better. So if you do have a little bit of agricultural land and you do want to make it a little bit better for wildlife, most of your objectives are going to revolve around providing some kind of year-round cover, so that's going to be the limiting resource. If you can get some trees planted that maybe your grandkids will be hunting under someday, that's awesome. But even just a wet little ditch that maybe doesn't even get a very good agricultural yield anyway, just leaving that to go to a grassland or even some woody cover is going to increase the amount of animals and the biodiversity that you can find on that landscape by a lot. And one thing that I wanted to throw on here, because I've had really good success with this in the past, is even a piece of ground that you think it's in the middle of nowhere, just a big flat open piece of ag ground. If you can get a dove plot in there, man, you can have a lot of fun. I've done this with some friends that have lived on places that weren't, seemingly not very good for many kinds of wildlife, but get a little sunflower field up there and you can have yourself a pretty good time in early September. Okay, food plots. So this is probably one of the most common wildlife management activities done, but it's probably overdone. Food is almost never going to be the limiting resource here in the Midwest. It could be much more limiting out west and in other areas, but we're a pretty productive place. Of course, if you've got the woods, you've got the mast, you've got a variety of different forbs and grasses that all the wildlife are going to use year round. So, a food plot is not the end all be all solution. That being said, it certainly can congregate deer and make, get some predictable movement patterns for deer and other critters as well. So food plots is another management activity that doesn't require a large tract of land to do. You can have a pretty small piece of land and plant out food plots for different critters and, have an opportunity to see those critters close to your home. So the primary food plots that are planted out there are going to be broken into two different types. And what we've got here in the picture is a real dense green browse food plot, which are popular for deer, but these are used by turkeys as well. And other critters too, and then grain food plots, which another popular and one that could persist later through the year. So here's talking about some grain food plots. Everybody thinks of corn, but this is more than corn. And think about something like milo. Milo is awesome because if you have the opportunity to leave it standing, it has access to those seed heads year round in the winter when it can be really hard to find food. So Milo's a great grain food source for birds and a lot of different species. Unharvested grain crops should be at least 30 foot wide and adjacent to woody cover. In general, grain plots recommended to be 1 acre per every 40 acres. So you can have really small food plot that's going to provide enough food for deer in a pretty large area. So if you've got 40 acres, primarily wooded, if you can just get 1 acre of food out there, you're going to be probably doing pretty good. Typically, grains are going to be planted August through October, and rye, oats, and wheat are some of the popular ones there. Right, green browse food plots. So these we saw there in the initial picture there. These are great, especially I love hunting these in the sort of early to mid season, and then also in the late season, because you can see sort of the guy pulling up, I think that's a turnip there, but a lot of these green food plots are going to have tubers and large tap roots and stuff that the critters can eat even late in the year to replenish their fat restores and carbohydrates. So real good food source early in the year and then also late. So really good food plot, nice and diverse. And a lot of times this is going to be a mix of legumes and then and grasses as well. Great for deer, rabbits. You could also see turkeys out there. Turkey season just ended up. Well, I guess we got a few more days left, but we're nearing the end. All right, suburban habitat. So this is another habitat type like agricultural habitat that has obviously increased exponentially in modern times. But this is not a habitat type that is completely devoid of critters or of hunting opportunities for that matter. Now, a lot of times these green spaces almost make like little islands of habitat. So there may not be a whole lot of mixing with the outside populations. And for hunting purposes, a lot of these are going to be limited to archery only. But some of them can be, surprisingly loaded with wildlife. And some critters in particular have really adapted well to suburban habitats and do almost better there than in some other habitat types. And raccoons, deer, and peregrine falcons are some that come to mind. As kind of a recent phenomenon when peregrine falcons, that were a listed bird, were found. A lot of them started nesting in cities because the tall skyscrapers kind of simulated the rock ledges and places that they used to nest where it was hard for predators to get to them. And then, of course, the pigeon population made a really great prey source for them. So something you may not expect, raccoons and deer, we probably expect a little bit more because we see them all the time. Probably have some raccoons getting into your garbage right now. And this is a habitat type that is, of course, still increasing. So even though it may not be quite as pretty as a nice prairie or wetland, it's certainly one we don't want to overlook and one that does have value to a lot of different species. With that, I think I'm turning it back over to Dan for the prairie. Ooh, and look at that.
Thanks,
pretty
Curtis.
prairie.
Yeah, so now we're going to dive into the next habitat type, which is prairie. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time here. But one thing I want to highlight is that prairie is the most threatened habitat in Illinois and across much of this country. A lot of it has been, like Curtis mentioned, has been over time converted to agriculture. But one thing I really want to highlight is the temporary nature of prairies. So prairies are not permanent. They are by nature temporary. And so there's this concept called succession. So over time, prairie habitat that's unmanaged will start to receive woody encroachment. And over time, that succession is going to start turning these areas into forest. So consistent management, whether it's through fire, grazing, cutting or spraying, strip disking, there's a lot of different management techniques that we'll kind of highlight here, but it's important to note that these management techniques are required to essentially keep this area prairie before it starts to convert back to a full-fledged timber stand. But just to put it in perspective on how much prairie we've really lost in Illinois, you can see here this is just a quick graph showing the pheasant harvest and pheasant hunters in Illinois. And you can see, back in the 1950s, there was a pretty substantial pheasant population. In about the 1970s is when we really started to see this shift to kind of large scale agriculture. And the pheasant population has started to suffer from that. And the quail population follows pretty much the exact same trend. And so these two types of birds are considered galliforms, and that means they are ground nesting birds. So unlike your other birds, your dove and some of the pigeons that you may see that will kind of create nests up in trees and things, these are going to be nesting on the ground. And so when we lose that critical prairie habitat that's really critical to their nesting success and where they nest, we've seen that population just drastically decline throughout the 70s. And again, there's been a lot of really good work. You can see here in the year 2015, it's starting to kind of have an uptick. Now it's a slight uptick, but it's certainly an improvement. A lot of that is just due to the amount of work that conservation organizations have been doing on habitat, trying to rebuild these areas and make a thriving prairie again. But what is a prairie? So a prairie is a grassland, and there's kind of two types of grasses that we want to highlight here. First is going to be the native warm season grasses. And so if you're ever out on some of the IDNR sites, or maybe even some of the local county parks, and you see these really tall grass prairies, typically those are going to be your native warm season grasses. So native warm season grasses, by nature and by their name, that's kind of why they're named like this, are very adapted to warmer and dry weather, and will remain green during kind of July and August all the way through the summer, because that's their growing season. They're growing during those kind of warm season months. Where in the kind of opposite end of the spectrum is your cool season grasses. So these are going to grow best in spring. If you walk, we all know if you own a yard, you're probably starting your mowing regime the past few weeks, or maybe here pretty soon, and those are going to be your cool season grasses. So those are typically growing right now. They're growing rampant, but there's a few structural differences between the two that really highlight the advantageous nature of these native warm season grasses to wildlife. And so I want you to look closely at this top picture. And so this is tall fescue, which is a cool season grass, but I want you to look how evenly and how, that even distribution across the ground. It has this very kind of consistent nature to form kind of what we call a sod forming grass. So these are sod forming grasses in comparison to native warm season grasses, which are clump forming. And so if you look at this bottom picture, you can see the big differences between those two. You have these individual isolated clumps of grass rather than kind of this overall mat of grass. And you may ask yourself, why is that important? And this illustration right here gives a really good highlight and kind of really shows why it's so important. Now, the big reason why it's so important, if you can imagine, the size of a baby quail, or the size of a baby pheasant that's, maybe a little bit bigger than a golf ball, it can be very difficult for them to rummage around on the ground and look for seeds, especially in these sod forming grasses. Now, in this grass that has this kind of clump forming nature with the native warm season grasses, it essentially creates kind of this maze underneath the kind of vertical structure that they can get out and get away from avian predators that might see them, and they can just continue to seed search because there's access to bare soil. And so if you can see in this picture, there's bare soil exposed in between these clumps, where the sod forming grasses, the cool season, do not have this tendency. Now, I also use the term vertical structure, and I want to highlight why this is so important for native warm season grasses. If you can think of, yourself as a tiny quail, just kind of, walking around on the ground, maybe you have to go watch Honey, I Shrunk the Kids before you can envision that. But it is very important to have this vertical structure over top that really conceals them and really provides them cover from different avian predators, whether it's, different hawk species, different owls that may be out there. And so it's really important, not only the clump forming nature, but also this kind of vertical structure. Now, it also allows birds to kind of escape temperature extremes. So whether it's really sunny, they can get some shade and get out of that direct sunlight, but they can also use it in the winter as it provides a little bit of insulation, and particularly cover away from the snow and these things. And like I mentioned earlier, this is a critical nesting habitat. I mentioned pheasants and quail. Turkey are in the same group of ground nesting birds, and they nest in native warm season grass prairies. And if that habitat is not available for them, they typically will not be in that area. Now we'll talk a little bit about how to start your site prep and how to go about converting an area to prairie. And Preston, at any point, if you want to jump in on this slide, please feel free, because you have a lot more experience with this. But most grass and garden conversion projects are going to take a significant amount of effort and time. Now, one thing I do want to say right off the bat is if you go through this process and you establish a prairie, do not expect for it to look good in the first year. Don't expect for it to look good in the second year. It should really start coming into its own and start kind of maturing in that third year growing season following your initial planting. But kind of let's start off with the beginning. So obviously, at some point, unless you're working with kind of just a bare soil, which if you are, you're lucky, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to do some kind of removal. You're going to have to kill that existing vegetation that is present at that site. Now, what you're targeting is a minimum of about 50% of that area to be bare soil and bare ground. That will allow you to be able to, for that seed to have good seed to soil contact, to allow it to get good germination. And so you can really get that robust stand coming up in that first growing season. What's also really important is kind of the timing of your seeding. And this is where I'll ask Preston to jump in a little bit, because there is kind of 2 schools of thought, whether you're going with the fall seeding or the spring seeding. So Preston, could you kind of clarify those 2 kind of seeding timeframes?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the site prep before I get into timing, site preparation is the most important and critical step of planting your grassland. I mean, if you don't do the site prep to get that good ground contact with the seed, you're basically just wasting your time and effort, because whatever you had in there previous is going to come back. But to get to timing, you've got your frost seeding period, and then you've got your growing season period, which currently we're in the growing season period. If you do want to do the planting now or early fall, the soil on the top layer is going to have a dense layer that's going to protrude the soil or the seed from getting into the soil. So you may have to up with a harrow or a disc, very lightly, just scratching that subsurface layer just to break that surface tension to penetrate the ground with the rain. The other one is frost seeding, and that's our favorite way of recommending it getting planted. Generally, from late November through this year, I mean, it was probably even first week of April. In most places, you could get a frost seeding, and that's when the soil pores are opening and closing due to the frost, because when it freezes, those soil pores close real tight, and when it thaws, they open up and they suck that soil. They suck the seeds down into the soil to that natural depth that they are planted. It's the easiest way. It requires less site prep, and there's a lot of different methods, whether it be mixing it with fertilizer and broadcasting it in a big seeder, or using a specialty seeder, or even broadcasting it via hand, like in the pictures shown. So lots of different ways. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact one of us biologists or your local NRCS office, and they can help you out the best we can.
Perfect. And kind of going on and kind of continuing this conversation, the seed that you choose is very important. Now I'll let kind of Preston jump in here, because they do sell seed. But the most important thing about your seed is deciding upfront what your goals for that individual prairie or that prairie conversion are. Because you have a lot of different options. You can do kind of a more pollinator-based habitat, which has a lot more herbaceous form. So these are going to be flowering plants. And you can pick a seed mix that provides flowering plants throughout the entire season. So you could pick some early bloomers, some mid bloomers, and some late bloomers to ensure that you always have something in flower for the pollinators. Or you could do a little bit more of a grass heavy mix if you're mainly focused on, pheasant or quail habitat. Now I will say pollinator habitat is really excellent pheasant and quail habitat to begin with as well. But I'll let Preston kind of dive into some of the seed options that are available.
Yeah, so most of our seed mixes that we offer, do have those forbs incorporated in it, just due to the fact that they do provide so much more benefit for all species of wildlife. But the general conception is, are you a deer hunter or are you a upland bird hunter? I mean, if you're mostly a deer hunter and your goals are mostly deer oriented, we're going to recommend you plant more of a tall grass prairie, which is going to be your big blue stem, your switchgrass, your Indian grass. Your taller grass is where those deer can get in there and hide away from predators. They can have their fawns in it. Whereas the short grass is going to be your little blue, your side oats, gamma, a lot of different forbs. It's shorter, and it's, you got to think of yourself as that little quail or that little turkey poult running around in there. I mean, if it's dark, tall, switchgrass, big blue stem, you're not really going to want to use that. But if it's shorter and a little bit looser, like little blue stem grows, that can be just that much more beneficial. So really three trains of thought. You got pollinator, your big stuff, and then your little stuff. And then you can customize that to any which way, whether your site's wet, whether your site's highly erodible. Lots of different options there. Again, come talk to us, and we'll get you get you going with the best bet for you.
Perfect. And like I kind of mentioned when we first started off on this slide, I just want to reiterate, it takes several years to get a nice, healthy prairie restoration project established. So again, your first and second year, it's not going to look great. It's not going to look pretty, but it's going to be maturing slowly over time. And there will be some management that's kind of required. And that's what we're going to dive into right now. So like I mentioned, when we first started talking about prairie, I mentioned that prairie is by nature a temporary habitat type. Over time, succession starts to slowly encroach, and you'll start to get a lot of woody vegetation that over time is going to start crowding out a lot of these prairie plants. And also eventually they're going to start growing up to the point where they're going to block out sunlight, and that's going to really restrict what can grow in those areas. So grasslands need this kind of periodic disturbance to encourage plant growth, as well as kind of recycling nutrients, and also to, like I mentioned, setback succession. And so there's a lot of different management techniques that can be implemented to kind of set back succession on these prairies. And we'll kind of go through them, a quick pros and cons list really quick. So prescribed burning is going to be the most beneficial. It's going to be the most cost effective in many instances. And it's also a great way to manage a large block of prairie in a very little amount of time. I've been on several prescribed burns over the years that are, 40, 50 acres, and you can have that entire prairie burned in about an hour. Oftentimes the actual burning process takes even less than that. Strip disking is another reasonable management technique. And so this is like Preston mentioned, when you're trying to scratch up that surface for that initial seed to soil contact, you're kind of essentially doing the same thing. You're just going to disc in strips. So you don't want to, disc an entire section or an entire field. You want to do it successively. So you want to do one strip, move over about 15 yards, do another strip, and just over time, then the following year, those areas that you didn't strip disc, you can go in and strip those fields and just slowly make your way over time, so that every year you're managing some of it, but over a 3 to 4 year period, all of it will have been strip disc. Another kind of popular management technique is herbicide treatments. So if you have some invasive species that popped up, or maybe you're trying to go for a very dense grassland without herbaceous plants, if that's your plan, then herbicide treatments can be really effective, because you can use a broadleaf herbicide that does not harm grasses, and you can cover that area, and it will essentially kill all the other plants but leave the grasses intact. Another really popular technique, and this is what I've used on our own personal property in Missouri, is interseeding. And so this is a great way to just continually add to that seed bank. So you're just adding new seed year after year to just re-stimulate that growth. Now, another management technique that a lot of landowners use that's not very effective for setting back succession and for managing a prairie effectively is mowing. Now, if you get that urge to mow your prairie, I will urge you to please do it outside of the primary nesting season. And I think, Preston, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's mid-April in Illinois. I think you don't want to mow after April 15th. Is that correct?
April 15th through August 1st. And
Perfect.
even
So there you go. So
if your goals are quail and pheasant, we even recommend pushing that back to even a September 1st or even a September 15th date if you must mow.
perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So like I said, mowing can be done, but there's much better and much more cost-effective management techniques that you can use to manage that prairie. And since we mentioned that prescribed fire is most often used by a lot of people, it's the most cost effective, it's the most kind of economical form of disturbance. If you think back to Illinois, so Illinois, like Curtis showed back in the 1850s, pre-settlement was historically this was a very prairie driven state. And you may think, well, why didn't succession start to take over? Well, there was natural fire on the landscape. And over time, we've essentially, as humans, we have removed all fire from the landscape. And now, as conservationists, they're starting to put fire back in the landscape because it's a very integral part of managing these habitats and managing for wildlife. Now, obviously, I do want to give some caveats first about prescribed fire. Safety first. If you're interested in conducting a prescribed burn on prairie, I recommend reaching out to Pheasants Forever, NRCS, the Soil Water Conservation District, and get a full-fledged burn plan, because these burn plans are basically going to have a very specific prescription. That's kind of why they're called prescribed fires. And so this burn plan you can kind of view as your prescription. So it's going to have what the relative humidity must be, what the wind direction, what the wind speed must be, what some of the atmospheric conditions are. And all these are kind of categorized so that you can have a safe and controllable fire that will meet your specific objectives for that burn, but also maintain safety and make sure that you're not causing a lot of smoke issues. So we want to have that atmosphere be nice and volatile, so it pulls that smoke column up and disperses it above, rather than it just kind of settles down. So again, if you're interested in prescribed fire, get a burn plan for your property, and you can get a burn done in no time, really. I will say in Illinois, there is a burn permit required through the Illinois EPA. It's a fairly non-extensive form. I think the last one I filled out was a page and a half. I don't know if they've updated it in a few years, but it's a fairly basic document, but it just, again, tells the Illinois EPA what you're doing, what you're burning, what your objectives are, and then they'll give you the approval if they think your prescription is right. Now, I will say, again, you want to avoid the natural nesting periods, just like Preston mentioned with mowing, but there are kind of two schools of thought with burning. So you can either do a spring burn or even a fall burn. And the nice thing about a fall burn, it's kind of easy to remember. Fall fires favor forbs. So if your goal is kind of that pollinator habitat that has a lot of kind of herbaceous flowering vegetation, a fall fire can be really advantageous for those areas, where if you want to manage specifically for grasses, you may go with a spring burn. And Preston can probably jump in with some thoughts here as well, on those kind of two different burn timings, but that's kind of the gist of it. If you're focusing on forbs, you want to burn in the fall.
Yep, you pretty much hit it on the head there.
Perfect. I like it. And again, if you do any kind of prescribed firing, you do want to contact the local fire department first, just to, again, give them a heads up that you're doing this. Now, on that burn plan and on that EPA permit, they will ask you to list a lot of that information there anyway, but you want to make sure that you call them the day that you plan on burning. I normally call them the day before, and then I'll call them the day of, and then I'll also call them after the burn.
I live in an HOA on the south side of Champaign, and we had our fire last fall, and we worked with Pheasants Forever, and I forget the gentleman's name who we worked with, but they did a fantastic job. They made sure we were following all the different regulations and everything like that, and all they asked for was just a donation to Pheasants Forever. The guy basically volunteered his time, and it was a fantastic experience. So if you work at an HOA even and you guys have some land that you need burned down, you can work with Pheasants Forever for that as well.
Now, this is kind of a rough overview of what some burns might look like. Now, again, every burn plan is going to have a different strategy and a different process just due to the habitat that's there and the goals of the specific burn. But this is kind of a fairly common burn. And so this is what's considered a back burn or a backfire. So if you look closely at the top of the map, you can see which way the wind is blowing. So obviously it's blowing in from the north, kind of heading in a southeast direction. And if you think about a fire, so if you were to maybe light this specific plot at the, let's say the north side of this field, that wind is going to propel that fire at a pace that is very hard to control, right? And so using this kind of backfire techniques allows that fire to just kind of slowly back into the wind. It's going to consume that vegetation, recycle those nutrients back to the soil, and germinate some of these seeds. Some of these prairie seeds essentially require fire to be able to germinate. And so as that fire slowly creeps back into the wind, that's a very safe and a very controllable fire. Now, one thing that is very important to prescribed burning is having adequate fire breaks set up ahead of time. Now, the fire breaks can be a variety of different things, right? There can be concrete, there can be water, but what you'll see in a lot of cases is just bare soil. So in a lot of cases, you know, the day or two before a fire, a landowner might go out and do kind of a basically create fire breaks. And so they might go out and disc a few strips about 10 to 15, feet wide. Typically, I think you want to try to get about 3 times the height of the vegetation for your fire break, just to ensure that it doesn't kind of waft over. But the fire breaks are really integral because it just keeps that fire contained. You're essentially removing the fuel from those areas so the fire can't continue to move forward. Now, if you are interested in prescribed burning it, you may kind of look at this equipment list and think, oh my gosh, that's a lot. But the nice thing is a lot of the NRCS offices or the Soil and Water Conservation District offices very often have a lot of this equipment that they will allow different landowners to use. So if you are, again, looking to do this, I would reach out to them and see what equipment they have, and you can kind of go from there. But in this specific instance, on this kind of burn, so there's kind of 2 schools of thought. You can do a ring fire, which is to start right where it says kind of start first here. And you're essentially just going to essentially light the fire all the way around in a circle. So you'll have one person go left, one person go right, and just kind of light the entire edge of that field, and eventually they'll meet up. In the theory of a backfire using kind of this round fire is that by the time you go to light the head fire, which is where that wind is blowing directly into the flames and is going to really carry that fire forward. By the time you ignite that head fire, this black area will start to expand because, again, you're backing that fire all the way across that field. So it will have consumed a lot of fuel at that point. And so you're basically letting the head fire then work to the pre-burnt areas where there's no fuel. And it's, again, a really safe and effective way to fire. But you can see in this case, you can also do kind of a staggered approach where instead of, doing a ring fire, you maybe just cut slits through the field and just have several different people light those backfires. Now, if you're doing this kind of strategy, I highly recommend you have a very coordinated effort. You have people that you trust and people that have a lot of burning experience. Because again, you never want to light a head fire with somebody behind you. Now, when we're thinking about, habitat management for hunters, this is kind of we've talked a little bit about what some of these management techniques are, how they can be implemented, but now what does it look like on the landscape? And maybe you're not a private landowner. Maybe, you hunt exclusively public land. Well, how does a lot of this impact you? Well, what it can really do is tell you a lot about the management on that site. So when I'm, out pheasant hunting, I'm very specific about the habitats that I'm looking for. Now, if you're, doing the controlled pheasant hunts, this is not so much an issue, but if you're interested in hunting wild birds and wild pheasants, it's very important to find the habitat that's right. It kind of comes down to a simple school of thought, right? If you're trying to hunt an area and the habitat's just not right, chances are the birds aren't going to be there. And so you want to maintain and make sure you're hunting areas that are going to hold those birds. So with pheasants, you're looking for several different things. You're looking for, again, that overall structure of grasslands, but you're also looking for brood rearing cover and protection from the elements. And this can be kind of in different varieties, right? So it can be woody cover. Now, brood rearing habitat is very often kind of very short grassy areas that allow these birds to, again, get in there and seed search. Now, fairly mature grasslands that kind of have woody vegetation on the outer fringes are some of my favorite areas to pheasant hunt. Especially as pheasant season progresses and it starts to get a little bit colder, you'll start to see those birds hang a little bit closer to the woody cover than they might earlier in the season. So I really like hunting these areas that have a nice prairie grass stand that's got these nice clump forming grasslands that has some adjacency of woody cover present. Very often this is just going to look like, a prairie with a ditch near it, a prairie with a fence row near it. Or even stream corridors. Stream corridors are notorious for holding pheasants because in a lot of cases, if it's next to a prairie, these stream corridors are going to have a lot of brushy habitat. They're not going to have, full-fledged oak trees and sycamore trees. In a lot of cases, it's going to be this very shrubby, very woody, and very thick habitat. And you'll find a lot of pheasants in these areas. And now you might think, well, quail are similar. They probably use the same habitat. Well, to some extent, that's correct. But what I like to say is good quail habitat is usually good pheasant habitat, but good pheasant habitat is not always good quail habitat. And we'll have Preston jump in here a little bit as well, because he has a lot of experience managing for bobwhite quail. But one thing I want to highlight is they are very reliant on woody cover. So woody cover in these escape routes are very important. And I want to define a term really quick before we move on. And this term is going to be a covey. So a covey is basically just a group of quail. And you can see here in this bottom picture here, this is essentially a covey of quail nesting, or not nesting, roosting. And so you can see they're just sitting on the ground. They kind of have all their butts together as they kind of face in an outward direction. Excuse me. And this really aids in kind of thermoregulating themselves. They can kind of use that body warmth from each other to kind of hunker down and kind of, just keep warm and excuse me, especially through those kind of cold winter months. But I'm going to turn it over to Preston real quick, and he'll kind of highlight what the importance of woody cover is for quail.
So when we're talking about finding quail on the landscape, generally they're going to be where you have a water source, a food source, some sort of a light grassy source, and a woody source, all close together. So if you're out on public land and you're looking for quail, you look at your maps and try to find those areas that are, have all these different types of habitat right together. Generally, you'll find quail there. The importance of woody cover is that they use it for cover from aerial predators. They use it for cover from winter storms. They use it for just about anything. And it gives them another source of their area to find the source of food. It's such an important thing that we've even at Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, have even started a new initiative called Fence Rows for Wildlife, trying to promote these shrub rows back onto the landscape, because in some ways that is that limiting factor that is keeping the quail from being on that landscape. You might have the ag, the grassy habitat, the water, some dense cover, but you're just lacking that shrub row, that shrubby habitat where it's loose, where they can move through it easily, but yet dense enough that they can be protected from the outside sources.
Well said. Perfect. Now we're going to dive into forest habitat. So Adam and I are going to take you through this. Take it away, Adam.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so a few points here to hit about forest habitat. It can be anything from along drainages, places that are untillable. Of course, forest equals critters. We're going to talk about early successional and mature hardwood forests, cedar, pine, bald cypress, and different kind of species variation. And then, of course, forest is always year-round cover and year-round food. So forest succession, of course, it is a process. It takes a long time to build and grow a piece of mature woods. So just a cool little graphic here that you guys can see from step 1 all the way to step 6. And that can take anywhere from about 75 to 150 years. So some equipment you need for woodland management, of course, chainsaws, skid steer, mulcher. That's kind of some bigger equipment. We'll have a picture of that for you. Of course, you don't need that for all situations, but it is definitely something you can think of for bigger projects. Backpack sprayers, chemicals for spraying invasives and other plants that you're trying to get rid of. And then, of course, you guys should be familiar with this one already, the drip torch, as Dan covered that one pretty extensively in the Prairie section. So moving on, so TSI, that is stands for Timber Stand Improvement. So here are a few things you guys can think of that are considered TSI. So selective harvest, clearings, edge feathering, brush piles, burning, and invasive removal. And here in the top right corner, we do have a picture of that skid steer mulcher. As you guys can see, obviously, it's getting into some thick stuff. So that's something that you might want to use one of those for in that application, but obviously not necessary for most projects. So selective harvest. So a good rule of thumb, Preston gave us this one, actually. It's a good little line here. When the woods are dark in the summer, it's time to do some selective harvesting. If you guys notice that, the sun is bright outside and you're in the woods and it's, super shady and almost a little bit chilly in the summer, that's a good time to think about trying to thin out the woods a little bit and getting some more sunlight down on the forest floor. So what selective harvesting is basically cutting of mature or defective trees to promote growth of the younger trees in the area. It can also be profitable. So if you guys have what some foresters like to say, quote unquote, money trees, walnut, oaks, and hickories. If you guys have a good amount of old standing walnuts, oak, or hickories, you guys can make some money off logging that on your property. So that could be a good way to kind of thin the woods that way. You can also thin out some unwanted species of trees, trees that are competing with canopies of the nicer trees like oaks and hickories. You can also, try to log those as well, or just plain cut them down or leave them, for habitat on the ground. But also that is clearing out the canopy, letting the nicer trees grow, bringing some light into the forest floor, and promoting good growth. So clearings. Clearings, pretty self-explanatory. Clearing a section of woods. This can be due to invasive plant removal, clearing for future food plots if it's recreational hunting property, clearing for native tree planting. Again, harvesting timber planting. It can also happen for easements, lanes, and right-of-ways, or if somebody's planning on building a house on a piece of property or something like that. But that's basically what a clearing is. Edge feathering. This, I think, is almost all of our favorite kind of way to do some TSI. It promotes a lot of habitat for all sorts of wildlife. It keeps everything happy. And basically, this management technique can help improve nesting around the edges of woodlands and fields. Basically, what you're looking for is kind of like tiers of different habitats. So if you can see, of course, there's a road or a lane, then short native grass. Then a little bit taller, you have some cut down brush, some brush piles, and some native shrubs, and then of course the mature forest. So it kind of gives habitat for everything, small game and of course big game, and keeps everything happy. And it's nice. It's a nice way to have transitions, and of course, great place for brush piles, native shrubs, and grasses. And again, you're just trying to create that low story, mid-story, and tall story habitat. Anything else to add on that, Dan or Preston?
No, but like you mentioned, when I'm out, scouting for deer specifically, I'm always looking at what that edge looks like. If you've taken some of our earlier kind of 101 or more kind of deer stand placement type classes, we really focused and highlighted the concept that a lot of game species are what we call edge species. And so that means they really like that intersection between two habitat types. But what can really deter them from utilizing that edge is if it's a very hard edge. So if you have, a full-fledged mature timber stand that's got, these trees that are, 2 foot in diameter right along the edge of a prairie, that's a very hard edge because it goes from a very tall habitat to a very short habitat. Like Adam mentioned, you kind of want to have that tiered approach where it goes tall to kind of medium to short, and then down to that fine scale of prairie. And so those are the areas as a deer hunter that I really gravitate towards, are these areas that have a very soft edge, for lack of a better term. Yep,
well said.
And what I would like to add specifically about the selective harvest slide, in a lot of cases, if you're doing, a timber stand improvement, which is just, again, overall kind of reducing the tree density in an area, you don't always have to drop the trees. A lot of times, if you're on a public DNR site, you may walk up to a tree and it looks like they kind of took a chainsaw around basically the base of it. What that's doing is essentially cutting through that bark and exposing that inner tissue of the tree, and you're essentially killing the tree that way. But what's nice about it is, again, it creates different habitats for different species. And so the real cool thing about doing some of these kind of girdling is what it's called, is it creates snags, or it creates dead trees that are just kind of left standing. And those are very important to a lot of wildlife species, particularly your woodpeckers, your squirrels that like to nest inside of trees. Now, we've all seen kind of squirrel drays where they kind of build the nest out of leaves and those type of things. That's not necessarily their preferred nesting site. They would much rather find an internal cavity inside a tree that they can build a nest in. But what that tells you is, if you're in an area that has a lot of these exposed drays, what that tells you is there's probably not a lot of this kind of traditional nesting habitat through creating these snags. And so if you're ever at a DNR site and you see just kind of rings around all these different trees, that's a pretty good indication that they're doing some kind of TSI, and they're opening up that canopy to allow that sunlight to penetrate and smack the kind of forest floor of the soil and really regenerate that next kind of generation of woody plants.
Yes, awesome. Thank you for bringing that up, Dan. That was very important. But moving on, so we're going to be talking about brush piles now. So brush piles are another great way to create habitat on your property. This can be done with tree trimmings, cut invasives, or just even clearing debris. It's great for ground nesting birds and rabbits. And just a quick point, if you are planning on making brush piles, make a few smaller piles scattered around than just one great big one. That obviously will give more rabbits and birds a chance to nest. And there's a good example of a brush pile right there with some good volunteers.
And typically, when you're creating a brush pile specifically, let's say you're targeting rabbits, like Curtis mentioned, this is great rabbitat. And it's really important the kind of way that you build these brush piles, right? Now, you could certainly just pile a bunch of brush onto an area and it will certainly get some use. But if you build it in a way that you kind of lay one of the limbs kind of on a stump, or you start off with the bigger chunks at the bottom and kind of slowly build up to the smaller vegetation and the smaller kind of sticks and different woody kind of trash, it will really allow these rabbits to kind of get in there, burrow, and they will start to use that brush pile within a week. I guarantee it. If you don't believe me, try it and you will see a rabbit within that brush pile very, very quickly.
Yes. So moving on, we're just going to quickly touch on invasive plant removal and some techniques you guys might encounter. Pretty common one is just a cut and spray. So you would just cut the invasives off and spray the stump of it. Of course, heavy machinery removal, cut and burn, multiple burns, and plucking and stacking.
And I want to highlight really quick why it's so important to spray the vegetation, right? So you could go into an area and maybe it's full of bush honeysuckle or honeysuckle like you see in this picture here. And maybe, let's talk about bush honeysuckle, for instance. It's kind of overtaking a lot of the Midwest habitats. It's a very invasive species. It's very prolific, but it has a very tendency to resprout. So if you were to just go into an area and kind of clear it of all of the existing bush honeysuckle that's there, within a year, it's going to start growing right out of those cut stumps. And so essentially you're going to cut the plant and you're going to apply a little bit of herbicide to that cut plant. You can either do it, just spraying it, or some people dip. I've used they're little like foam paintbrushes in the past, and you just kind of wipe it on there. And then it will kind of suck that herbicide down into the roots. It will kill that plant to ensure that you don't kind of have this issue of resprouting. Because if you were just to go in there and cut it, it's all going to resprout that next season, and over time you'll have the same issue. So if you do have some big invasive problems, you probably do want to look at using some type of herbicide. And again, if you have any questions about that, contact the Farm Bill biologist or the NRCS offices, and they'll be able to give you some guidance on what herbicide to use, when to use it, and how to apply it.
Perfect. So some invasive removal here. If you have smaller areas that have invasive such as bush honeysuckle, you can usually cut and spray these areas. This would leave you with a lot of material for brush piles. And of course, like Dan just mentioned, spraying the stumps would effectively kill the invasive. If you have young invasives and they are not woody yet, then you can just spray these areas, but you would have to try to hit 60 to 70% of them to effectively see them get knocked back.
Now, I'll kind of expand on this concept of bush honeysuckle, just because it's one of the more prolific invasive species in the forest in Illinois. The real cool thing about, I shouldn't say cool, but it's advantageous for us as conservationists or wildlife managers, is that it's one of those first plants that's going to emerge in the spring. So if, earlier this year, if you were, a few months back, we're walking around in the woods and you just started to see that tinge of green, and you started to see some green starting to leaf out really early, chances are that's bush honeysuckle. It's one of these plants that leaves dormancy early, but also enters dormancy late. And that gives us a real advantage, because you can go into an area that these, bush honeysuckle is still in its growing cycle where everything else is dormant. And you can spray these areas where it's going to kill off the honeysuckle, but shouldn't have too much impact on some of that other native vegetation there. And so that's a really nice kind of technique to use for bush honeysuckle. Unfortunately, that window is only about a week and a half on each side of the growing season. So it can be, tough to time it right, but that is a really good cost-effective way to manage a large-scale property. I know in Missouri, they've started doing a lot of aerial spraying for bush honeysuckle. So they'll figure out when this, growing this week and a half period is. They'll get a helicopter and they'll fly over a big patch of timber, and we'll just drop herbicide over the entire patch of timber, and everything else is dormant, so it's not going to disturb those plants, but those bush honeysuckles will kind of soak that in, and it'll kill it in a good way that should, in theory, not allow it to resprout back in the next growing season.
Sweet. So some invasive continued here. So again, as I mentioned previously, some areas are so thick that you will need some heavy machinery to help you thin them out. This works well for areas covered in multiple rows and briar patches, blackberries. Mulch these areas, and then you can come through with a burn or two. Pretty cool picture here. Well, not cool again, as Dan just said. Interesting picture, I should say. At the bottom here, you can see that there's someone standing in the invasives here, only about, a couple foot into the woods, and you can barely see him already just because it's so thick. So a spot like this would definitely benefit from some heavy machinery. If you have a very thick area as well, you can sometimes just knock this back with multiple burns. The first burn would effectively kill the invasive and make the woody plant brittle. And then the second burn would burn the invasive clear down to the ground. Whatever is left would make good brushy habitat. So that is another effective way to knock it back.
Now, we use this specific
Oh, I think you just cut out, Dan.
Yeah, I think he cut out, Adam.
No worries. We could just go to the next slide.
Sure.
So I included a few pictures here that I'm just going to go over quickly just to show you guys kind of the difference of what invasive management does. If you guys have ever been to Allerton Park here, just southwest of Champaign, sorry, in Monticello, these pictures are from there. So super neat area. They do a lot of good management and they let me use some pictures here. So here is just a timber burn. Basically what they're trying to do is burn the leaf matter and of course the invasives that are in the area. This is going to promote a bunch of, again, sunlight on the forest floor. Think if you have, a good few inches of leaf matter covering the ground, there's not going to be much growing. So you want to get rid of that. And of course it makes the woods look super nice and neat as well. So here's the burn, here's after the burn, shortly after, still smoking. Here is an area on the left before any management, any spraying, cutting, or burns. And then this is that same area after just one burn. So you guys can already see how much of a difference it makes. It really, tries to knock it back. And again, if you do one burn, it'll kill the invasive. If you do two burns, it'll just burn the rest of that matter just like a bonfire would, and it will burn it down to the ground. So it'll make it super clear. So I believe the next picture shows what this exact area looks like after the second burn. So I believe the first burn was in the fall time, the second burn was early spring, and then this area is what it looks like during the summertime. So you guys can see great native growth, super clear, and everything is getting plenty of sunlight and it looks awesome.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight how important this, what this specific picture illustrates. We've all seen, we've all walked through forest that kind of, looks like a park that's just there. It's very dark, not much sunlight is hitting the ground, and there's not a lot of vegetation there for wildlife to browse on. And so if you're, as a deer hunter, when I see areas like this, I start to get all giddy inside. That tells me instantly that there is probably a lot of different wildlife species, including deer, that are going to be in here browsing. They're going to be in here, bedding, and they're going to be using these areas a lot more than they will some of these areas, that just get no sunlight, that are really dark and just have nothing growing on the forest floor. So as a deer hunter, when I see, a picture like this or a site that looks like this when I'm out scouting, these are the areas that are instantly in the back of my mind, and that I will, plan to come back and try to hunt, because this just screams, deer habitat.
Yeah, and I would like to point out that we would all love for all the sites to look like this. So if you have a piece of ground that you can start your own project on, this picture right here is close to what your goal should look like. And then moving on to wildlife management, of course, that's the other side of forest management. So overbrowsing, deer populations need to be managed not only to ensure a healthy herd, but of course, to make sure property damage does not occur. Overbrowsing can be a sign of too many deer and not enough food. So I believe we have a couple pictures, but this one right here shows you pretty well. There's almost a line kind of a few feet off the ground where everything is just barren. And that is a good indication that there's too many deer in this area and they're searching for food and basically trying to eat anything that they can reach. Here's another good one, some overbrowsing. I believe Jason got this picture from a Cook County forest preserve. And of course, there's a lot of deer there and no hunting. So that is unfortunately what will happen.
And kind of an
yeah.
overarching kind of ecological concept that's kind of important to highlight here is the term carrying capacity. And so the term carrying capacity essentially looks at the total amount of an individual species that an area can basically sustain. So that's going to take into effect the cover the food availability, water availability. And here we're seeing an area that's essentially above that carrying capacity for that individual site, for specifically deer. Because again, they have pretty much, like Adam mentioned, eaten everything that's kind of beneath, that 5 foot range. And so over time, you're just going to start to see evidence of these deer getting, increased disease risk, increased starvation. Mother Nature has a tendency, if a population starts to encroach or go over that carrying capacity, these resources will be limited and the population will start to suffer. And so to maintain that kind of nice balance between, the deer population, but also the forest and the forest health, it's important to use hunting as a wildlife management tool.
Yep, so some more deer management here. Hunting, of course, is the best way to manage the populations. You want to try to achieve an even buck to doe ratio. Harvesting multiple does in the early season, of course, helps achieve this goal. And if you are a landowner, letting safe and legal hunters take a couple deer off the land would be very beneficial. So moving on to deer habitat. So multiple types of habitat close to each other. Of course, like Dan talked about before, deer are edge species. The more habitats you have kind of right next to each other, the more likely you will see deer in that area. Thicker areas and open timber adjacent to agriculture, CRP. And of course, edge feathering is perfect for deer. Like we see here in the picture, we have pretty good edge feathering. And then in the top picture, again, doe bedding adjacent to feeding area with timber in between.
And one thing I kind of like to highlight, especially since you mentioned, these multiple types of habitat that are close to each other. So not only are we looking at kind of the multiple types of habitat, but also the multiple types of resources, which are usually in conjunction with these habitat types. And you can kind of think about, yourself. If you live in a town that basically has everything you need, it's got your grocery stores, it's got your hardware store, it's got maybe an electronics store. You don't have to venture far outside of your home range to find all of these resources that you need to live your life. And wildlife are kind of the same. They kind of follow that same pattern. And so if you can find areas that have, all of these resources in a very finite area, that's really going to kind of concentrate the wildlife to this area, because again, it's going to reduce that home range because they're not going to have to walk, 2 miles to get to water. And so those are the things I'm looking about when I'm deer scouting, particularly, is trying to find these areas that have multiple types of habitat and that have multiple types of all these resources. So that for deer, we're looking for cover, we're looking for food, and we're looking for water.
Yes, perfect. So moving on to small game habitat. Maple forests you guys can see those kind of encroaching on areas that have a lot of older oaks and hickories. You want to try to burn these areas to keep the oaks and hickory ridges healthy, because the oaks and hickories are what squirrels and small game love. The maple forests don't have all as many benefits to small game. They don't produce a mast like acorns and so on. So keeping those oak hickory ridges healthy promotes a lot of small game habitat. And of course, brush piles for grasses, or brush piles for rabbits and native grasses promote that as well. And turkey habitat. Turkeys love disturbance on the landscape. Fire is perfect for turkey habitat. Here in the picture on the bottom, you guys have a nice, there was a tree line that got burned and then a wheat field. This was on public land, so perfect turkey spot right there. If you guys run into something like that, there's definitely gonna be turkeys in the area. Open, nice bottoms as well, and of course mature ridges with trees for them to roost on, as well as the acorn masses as well. And with that, we're moving on to wetland habitat.
All right, thanks, Adam. So we could have a webinar on all these different types of habitats and how they work, especially wetlands. They are the most biodiverse habitat that we probably see here, and that's because of the way that they're developed. I mean, it's both land and water, so hence wetlands. So you get a lot of plants living there, and you can also have fish utilizing it, insects utilizing it, birds, mammals, everybody is kind of using these wetlands. So it's very biodiverse and very important habitat to manage across any landscape here.
And before,
And give them that water. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but
Curtis?
before we go too much
Yeah.
further, I do want to mention, I know we're partnered here with Pheasants Forever with this webinar tonight. Pheasants Forever actually does have a wetland specialist on staff, Caitlin Beckemeyer. I believe I saw her name a little bit earlier on in this webinar. So if you are interested in doing some wetland management, you can reach out to Pheasants Forever, and they can certainly help guide you in the right direction too. You don't have to, think about reaching out to somebody else. You can also reach out to Pheasants Forever with that too.
Got it covered, Pheasants Forever. Well, now I feel great, Dan. I am not a wetland specialist, so I'm sorry, Caitlin, if I butcher any of this. All right. Well, Curtis, feel free to chime in as well, buddy. All right. So, so some waterfowl habitat here. So emergent wetlands, wetlands that have vegetation emergent from water. So those are the wetlands there that you're going to see the waterfowl utilizing, because that gives them stuff to eat. So you want them to come in and be able to feed. You have the dabbling ducks and the diving ducks. Dabbling ducks are going to prefer some of that more shallow water, where the diving ducks can go a little bit more deeper. And so land consists of marshes and swampy areas, and seasonal water influences plant communities. So you can have some plants are going to do better with water that's going to be there sometimes and not other times, whereas other plants are more aquatic plants and they would prefer to be wet all the time. So again, all these different biodiversities just provide so much different food resources for the wet waterfowl, with the fish, the insects, and the plants all living in one awesome location.
And the really cool thing about wetlands is that they can, like Jason mentioned, it can be a host of different plants. And the real cool thing is that water can influence, like he said, the seasonality and the diversity and the types of plants that come up. But you can also use water to influence invasive species. So maybe you have a wetland that you're getting a real bad, cocklebur issue. They can leave water on a little bit longer, so it'll basically kill out that invasive species. And so the science of wetland management and water management is really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you want to strive for a diversity of native marsh plants, and you're going to want to supplement by seeding millet, buckwheat, milo, and similar. Oh man, that's why I don't read slides. I like to go off of by head. But anyway, so seasonal food and vegetation to coincide with water flow migration and enjoy waterfowl migration. So again, you want to do what Jan just said. Basically, you can control what plants are going there depending on if you can control water to your habitat there. And you can do that in a couple different ways. So you can do it through pumps, valves, stop log gates, and other weirs and things like that you can install. Having this water factor in with this habitat does increase the price of all the different types of management that you're going to be doing for this, if you don't have a natural flow of water that you can control easily. So some of this may be pretty pricey to install, but it is pretty neat that you can do it. Anything you want to add here, Curtis?
Yeah, I'll jump in just about the different control structures that you might see on public land, or if you've got a piece of land that would be conducive for a wetland. These are things that you can contemplate. But like Jason said, wetland work is going to be one of the more expensive types of habitat work that you can do. But just like he said, with the biodiversity, it's also one of the ones that kind of gives you the most aesthetic value, I guess, arguably, and maybe the most biodiversity of the most different critters that you can encounter. But so these different control structures, your pumps and valves, these are going to be pretty basic. So a pump, if you want to utilize groundwater, so if you don't have a reservoir or lake handy, you can get a pump to pump groundwater if you get a permit, and this is highly expensive. A valve is going to be just a simple valve that you can open and close that's going to work like your faucet. And that would work if you had a reservoir, a river that you can draw from. or even just a big canal like what these people are working on here. But your stop log gates, these I think are my favorite because they give you complete control over the exact level of the water. And when it comes to wetland management, really the most cost-effective way to do it, just like we talked about with fire with the prairies, it's all about that water level management, and just a couple inches can make a big difference. So stop log, kind of a little diagram there. They've just got a series of little panels that you can put on, and these panels might just be, 4 to 6 inches tall. And so you can stack them higher and higher, and the higher you stack them, the higher your dam is and the more water you have, or vice versa. So pretty cool, neat little water control structure. And you can completely influence the herbaceous community on your wetland just by when and how you alter that water level. So pretty cool, really neat stuff.
Awesome.
Oh, and look at that dog. He's just looking
know.
out there, just ready to hunt. I can tell.
We do need to implement more dogs in every photo we put on our slide. Sorry about that. Yeah, so you can also be leaving the berm.
Our dog quota.
I know we have not met our dog quota. We need some more. I know Dan has a golden retriever this year. We should have got some more of those photos, Danny. I get him. I told you every webinar we need him wearing a different outfit. So you will likely need a lot of money to do any type of dirt work. So it looks simple, but that's usually compacted clay, and it takes a lot of money to move that and compound it in whatever form you want it to along your field or land there that you want to try to have some water build up at. You can use surveying equipment to figure out how high you need to make your dam to see where the water is going to, the high water line, and you want to have a couple of with a water supply and water control structures allows you to actively manage water level. So similar again with this HOA that I'm a part of, our dam just sprung a leak. So we have a little lake or pond, it's about 6 acres, and we have a similar earthen dam, and it was built in the 50s, and it was built with whatever was laying around. So they just took they didn't really use clay, they just chucked whatever they had and made this earthen dam. And we have a pipe that outlets, and that pipe sprung a leak and has washed away parts of the dam, and now we're having that rebuilt. And just digging down to fix the pipe is looking around about $40,000 to dig down to the pipe and replace it. We're going to have a weir put in, not a weir, but a temporary dam put in. So all this is very expensive work, and if it needs repair or maintenance, it's even more expensive. And muskrats also had a portion of that damage as well. And I know Curtis can talk a little bit more about muskrat and beaver damage and how they can be friends to wetlands and foes to wetlands.
And I also want to jump in. We keep talking about the price of wetland management. And when we first started this webinar earlier, we kind of ran through some of the various cost share programs that might be available through the Farm Bill program. There are specific programs designed for wetland management. So if you are, again, interested in trying to implement some of this wetland management on a property that you hunt or that you lease or maybe that you own, there are cost share opportunities available. Again, they typically have a pretty strict criteria. And oftentimes they're competitive, and so there's kind of a rating process, but those are available. And so you can talk to your Farm Bill biologist about that as well, or the wetland specialist, I should say.
There you go. One big threat to wetlands is invasive species. Similar to kind of how we were talking earlier about how forests can be choked out by mature trees, wetlands can be choked out by these, especially these two invasive species, the purple loosestrife and the Phragmites. These guys can grow very tall and take over entire areas, and birds aren't going to want to land in a giant patch of Phragmites. So having that open water is very important, and also important for everything else, the fish usage and insects and anything else that wants to kind of be in the open area, a kayaker who might want a pathway through the wetland to be able to kayak. So these are very common, and you should try your best to mitigate any of these before they establish themselves in your wetland. So again, talking about creating openings for muskrat and driven by muskrats and mechanical. So Curtis, you want to talk a little bit more about muskrats and stuff, because I know you're a big fan of muskrats.
Yeah. Big fan of muskrats.
Big
Yeah,
old fan
and,
of muskrats.
number one of the muskrat fan club, I think. So we're still taking registrations, but no. So you're when you think about a cattail marsh, and up to the north of us in Wisconsin, they've got Horicon, which is one of the largest cattail marshes in the whole country. But the primary driving management out there is muskrats. Muskrats are what goes out there and actually makes openings and makes this marsh more attractive and more usable to waterfowl and a number of other water birds and other critters. But the issue with muskrats is, like we saw in a couple slides ago, they can be friend or foe. So getting out there and making these pockets of open water is great, and that's awesome. But muskrats are a rodent, and specifically Chrysitidae, the mouse family, basically. So they are extremely prolific. In Illinois, they can have 3 litters per year. They can be reproductively mature at 6 months of age, and their litter size can be 6 to upwards of 13. So we're talking about enormous amounts of muskrat. And at Horicon Marsh in particular, they have to manage them pretty extensively through trapping, and they've done a lot of studies out there, and they've shown that even with an 80% reduction in muskrat numbers, there's no noticeable effect to the population as a whole from year to year. So pretty incredible, amazingly prolific. And to sort of walk that line to friend or foe, you can utilize trapping as a wildlife management technique. But you can also see those geese there. They're standing on a push-up. Another cool thing muskrats do in the fall, they create these push-ups out of a lot of times they're not touching the bottom, just out of emergent vegetation, and they'll make a little chamber that they can access from under the water. And then there'll be a dry spot, and they'll have these scattered all throughout the marsh. You'll see them pop up. And that's so they can just go around and feed from place to place and never really have to get out and get exposed, because pretty much everything likes to eat a muskrat. But waterfowl love those push-ups as a resting area, and then also a potential nesting spot too. So pretty cool little critters. There's my pitch for muskrats. They're cool.
Yeah, and kind of taking that a step further, I've actually done a lot of kind of mimicking this, what you see here in these geese below. If you're hunting, a marsh and it has a lot of these kind of dry spots, whether it's, from a muskrat push up or maybe just kind of a natural, slight inclination that causes it to be dry. A lot of times naturally putting decoys there is going to make it look a lot more realistic to any incoming birds. Again, with waterfowl, and especially with our decoys, we're trying to mimic what that wetland's going to look like naturally. We want to make it look like it's a real living, breathing, decoy. And so a lot of times putting them up on these little push-ups, putting up on little dry humps can really make that whole decoy spread look a little bit more realistic.
Awesome. Also with wetlands, you can manage some wood ducks, so woodies, and these can benefit any other nesting bird that's going to come and nest in a box. So you can look at the instructions there. You can download those offline. I'm sure there's a couple more that you can find online that give you the specs that will give you the best situation for a wood duck to want to move in. And make sure you have a predator control near the box. You can either do one of these, which I have in my bird feeder to try to keep squirrels off. So one of these like collars around the base of the tree, or a pipe in this case. And you can also try to have a piece of metal around the tree there to try to keep things from climbing up and getting into that box there for the ducks to have a place to live.
Yeah, and these boxes have been super successful. The big floods in 93 and 95 wiped out a lot of our what were our cavity producing trees. Our big, mature, old, dead snags were gone. And so these boxes stepped up, and at a time when wood ducks were not faring so well, after these boxes, they've rebounded where in the Mississippi flyway, and I think across most flyways, they're the number 2 duck in the bag, right behind mallards. So really cool. And also this picture, this is called Jump Day. So the really cool thing, once the little baby wood ducks hatch, and the mom is below calling them. At some point, the adorable little guys and girls got to jump out of that hole to the ground, and that is, if you're ever having a bad day, just YouTube wood duck or bufflehead jump day, and I guarantee you it'll turn your frown upside down, because there's about nothing funner to watch than a bunch of little adorable ducks bouncing on the ground.
And then, of course, you can then use your wetland to hunt over as well. So you can make sure you have some woody vegetation around the side there. You can use that as a natural cover, and you can hang them out in there, or you can build up a really nice blind there. You can have a permanent blind that you can utilize in your field if you can flood your field out like that. Anything else you want to add to that there, Curtis?
No, I'm just ready for duck season.
I know you are.
I'd like to jump in just for a quick second, just to highlight the importance of water depth. Jason kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate that there's kind of two groups of ducks, right? So there's your dabbling ducks, which are your mallard, and it's what most people are probably familiar with. These are called dabbling ducks, and they prefer very shallow water. They do not dive underneath the water to search for food or vegetation. So very commonly you'll just see kind of a little cute little duck butt sticking up in the air as it just kind of teeters forward and sticks its neck in the ground or in the water to get some seeds. Now, if you're hunting over a big lake or a big reservoir that has deep water, that's where you're going to be targeting those diving ducks. And so those are going to be your like Curtis mentioned, your bufflehead, your scaup, your ringneck duck. They like these big, open, deep bodies of water. And so when we're highlighting kind of these wetlands, we're really focused a little bit more on some of those dabbling ducks. Now, you can certainly get the occasional diving duck to come into these areas, particularly if it's adjacent to some deep water. But primarily when you're hunting a shallow wetland like this, you're going to be targeting dabblers. So that's going to be your mallard, your northern shoveler, and a bunch of other species. But really cool just to know that, where you hunt really dictates what species are coming, even if you're just hunting over a body of water. And like Caitlin mentioned, 6 to 8 inches of water is the sweet spot for dabbling ducks. So there you go, right from the wetland specialist.
Awesome. And again, just wanted to point out that Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever are a fantastic organization that do all kinds of habitat restoration across the state, and we cover that now. I mean, including wetlands and prairie and everything else. And they have chapters all over the state, and you can go to their websites to find more information about joining a chapter and helping them with their cause going forward.
And if you are interested in managing a forest habitat, there's a lot of foresters in the state as well. One organization is the National Wild Turkey Federation. They have, I think, 2 foresters on staff here in Illinois that can come out, look at your forest, write a management plan, and kind of guide you through that process of how to manage that timber stand.
And if you want to follow us on social media, feel free. You can follow us at the Illinois Learn to Hunt Facebook page, and we also have an Illinois Learn to Hunt Connections page. You can ask permission to join that group. We try to keep that to past participants, and you can go on there and just openly ask questions to other people that are either it's a wide range of people who have been hunting all their lives to people who just started hunting, or people that are interested in being part of a group where you can actually communicate to each other and kind of get some tips and tricks and answer any questions you may have there. You may also ask us any questions at any time. You can reach out to us through Facebook or our website with an email, and we'd be happy to help you answer any of those questions you may have. We also have the Instagram page that Adam's doing a great job trying to keep that interesting. So please follow us along there. He had some great turkey hunting photos this past spring, and you can check that out. And you also get similar updates and things like that through our Instagram page that you may have through our Facebook page. A lot of people are moving over to Instagram. I know now, barely use Facebook anymore, some people, and that's totally cool. But so you get those same type of reminders for tag lotteries and things like that. You'll see that through the Instagram page as well. So give us a follow over there. And then our YouTube page, we are building that up currently, and we're trying to add videos up there. We're going to be doing some more instructional videos and some interviews with different biologists, maybe some Pheasants Forever folk. We'll interview them at some point and have that up on there. And all very interesting conversations that are very pertinent and go right to the topics of what people are interested in learning about with hunting in Illinois. So we have a few more webinars coming up before summer. We're gonna probably take a break then with a lot of the heavy duty webinars, moving more into our YouTube channel and things like that. But so we have hunter etiquette coming up. So if you are a new hunter or old hunter who needs a etiquette lesson, please join us for that. So that's gonna cover all things kind of going on public land and the concerns that people may have, trying to up your confidence on what to expect going out to public land, what times you should be traveling around, what happens if you bump into another hunter, what if you're hunting the same area, how close should you be, what should you do if you do bump into one other hunter, as well as kind of the etiquette of taking photos and posting them online and presenting yourself as a responsible hunter and things like that. So we're developing that right now, and we're going to have that out on May 25th, and we're excited about that a lot. I know we had a bunch of brainstorming ideas, and so we're trying to even just whittle down the ideas that we had. We had so many ideas for that class. Then we're going to do a wild game hunt to cook event. We're going to be partnering with Illinois Extension's office, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be video in that one, and kind of doing almost like a cooking show is the plan, as long as our internet works out, and I think it should. So that's going to be on May 27th. So please join us for that. That's going to be really interesting. We've been planning that for a couple months now, so we're excited about that one as well. So if y'all have any questions, please put that in the Q&A box. If not, again, reach out to us at any time. We're a resource for y'all, and have a wonderful evening.